The hammer weighed 14 ounces. Nora Vale knew this the way she knew her own heartbeat. Not from measuring, but from 10,000 repetitions, from the way it settled into her palm each morning like something alive, like something that recognized her. Silas Morrow had forged it himself, shaped the hickory handle to fit a hand smaller than his own, balanced the head so that the strike came true without fighting the wrist. He had given it to her on a Tuesday in November, setting it on the anvil without ceremony, without explanation, the way a man offers a gift when words would only diminish it. That was 7 years ago. She had been 12 years old and already knew how to bank a coal-fire work a bellows without wasting air, and read the color of heated iron the way a farmer reads the sky. She had been learning these things in the margins of Silas's days, quiet as smoke watching from the doorway of the smithy until he finally stopped pretending not to notice her. She kept the hammer with her always after that. Even now, standing at the bottom of Red Creek Canyon, with her boots sinking into the sand and the whole weight of the Utah sky pressing down on her, she could feel its familiar heaviness against her hip, tucked into the loop of her work belt, where it had lived for 7 years. Everything else she had owned in the world was gone. The hammer remained. Above her on the canyon rim, 11 men had stopped their horses to watch. She had counted them without looking up. You learned to count things without looking when you had spent a childhood in a house where attention was a form of weakness. You learned to be aware of everything around you, while appearing aware of nothing. Silas had refined that skill into something useful, had taught her to listen to a piece of metal with her whole body, to feel the vibration of a strike travel up through her hands and tell her what the iron was saying. But the skill had started earlier in her cousin Aldous' house, where survival required knowing exactly where every dangerous thing was without letting it know you were watching. The men on the rim were laughing. She could hear it clearly. Sound carried strangely in the canyon, bouncing off the sheer sandstone walls in ways that made distant things seem close and close things seemed to come from everywhere at once. The laughter was the loose, comfortable kind that belongs to men who are entirely certain they are right about something. She did not look up. Before her, wedged deep into a sandy wash that cut through the canyon floor, was the wagon. It had been there long enough that the desert had begun to accept it as a permanent feature of the landscape. Wind-driven sand had packed itself around the wheel hubs. A scrub juniper had taken root between 2 of the spokes on the near rear wheel, growing at the determined angle that desert plants use when they have found purchase in stone. The canvas cover was entirely gone, reduced over the seasons to a few gray strips that fluttered from the iron boughs like the remnants of a flag after a long defeat. The back axle was snapped clean, the brake sharp and old, darkened by a 1.5 years of weather. The tongue was splinter driven into the sand at an angle that told the story of sudden violent impact. A wheel dropping into a hidden wash. The momentum of a loaded wagon continuing forward while the front wheels stopped, the wooden tongue taking the full force of that argument between motion and earth. The sideboards were bleached to a pale gray, but when she had run her hand along them the day before, she had felt the solidity of good oak beneath the weathering, the grain tight and dense, the wood still sound where it mattered. The iron tires were pitted with rust at the surface, but not eaten through. The hubs were intact. The spokes on 3 of the 4 wheels were solid. She saw what no one on the rim saw. They saw a wreck. she saw components. 600 board feet of usable oak lumber. Enough iron in the tires, bolts, and hardware to keep a small forge busy for a week. Hickory, spokes that could be repurposed as tool handles bracing framing members. The wheel hubs, properly cleaned and re-greased, could serve any number of purposes on a working homestead. And beneath all of it, the massive oak planks of the wagon bed itself, 3 inches thick. The kind of material that cost real money in a territory where every board foot of dimensional lumber had been hauled over mountain passes from Salt Lake. She had bought the salvage rights for $10. The man at the Crestfall land office had looked at her the way men in that town had always looked at her, with the particular expression that falls somewhere between pity and contempt, reserved for people who remind comfortable men of the fragility of comfort. He had taken her money with 2 fingers, as if the bills themselves carried some contagion of misfortune, and had written out the salvage certificate in the slowest, most deliberate hand she had ever witnessed. As though hoping she might change her mind before the ink dried, she had not changed her mind. The other $10 had gone to 2 pulleys and 50 feet of heavy hemp rope at Price's Mercantile, purchased from a clerk who tried 3 times to talk her into a smaller gauge at a lower price. She had refused each time with the same 2 words, the heavy rope. She had left with exactly what she needed, and nothing more. And she had walked back through Crestfall without stopping, without looking at the building on the corner, whose ownership had changed 3 weeks ago. The building whose cold iron smell she could still conjure without effort, whose every board and beam she knew the way she knew her own face. The smithy. Silas Morrow's smithy. Deacon Harlan Price's smithy now, according to a document that did not deserve the name. She drove the thought down the way you drive a nail through hardwood. 1 clean strike, don't let it bend. She had work to do. The problem of the wagon was not a problem of strength. Nora understood this clearly, and the clarity was itself a kind of power, because the men on the rim above her believed it was a problem of strength, believed they understood the situation completely, and their certainty made them stupid in ways she could use. The wagon weighed somewhere between 1,100 and 1,300 pounds. She estimated 1,200, accounting for the sand packed into the bed and the extra weight of the iron hardware. She weighed 128 pounds in her work clothes. Simple arithmetic made the task seem absurd, which is why the men on the rim were laughing, which is why they had not looked any further. But 1,200 pounds does not need to be lifted. It needs to be moved. And moving is a different problem entirely, a problem of friction and leverage and mechanical advantage, a problem that yields to patience and planning and a willingness to work in increments so small they look like nothing from a distance. Silas had taught her this with a demonstration she had never forgotten. He had taken the Peter Wright anvil, 400 pounds of forged English iron, the single most valuable object in his shop, and moved it 6 feet across the smithy floor by himself, using nothing but a pair of iron rods as rollers and 30 minutes of unhurried effort. She had watched with the focused attention of a child who understands they are being shown something important. He had not explained what he was doing while he did it. Only afterwards, sitting on his stool with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, had he said, "The limit is usually not the weight of the thing. The limit is the idea you have about the weight of the thing." She spent the first hour not touching the wagon at all. She walked the terrain around it with methodical care, reading the land the way Silas had taught her to read iron, not for what it appeared to be, but for what it actually was. She tested the soil at the base of each candidate anchor point, with the heel of her boot pressing down, feeling for give. She examined root structures. She studied the angle of the bank that rose from the wash floor to the flat ground above, estimating grade, identifying the line of least resistance. The juniper growing from the wagon wheel was, she concluded, more deeply rooted than it appeared. She tested this by gripping a low branch and throwing her full weight against it. The tree did not budge. She marked it in her mind as an anchor point. 40 yards up the bank, a sandstone outcropping protruded from the slope at chest height, its base buried deep in the compacted earth of the canyon wall. She struck it 3 times with the flat of Silas's hammer and listened to the sound. Solid. She marked it too. From a deadfall cottonwood she had found the previous day, she had already shaped a lever 8 feet of dense, straight-grained wood. One end sharpened to a wedge, the cross-section at the fulcrum point as thick as her upper arm. It had taken her most of the previous afternoon with a belt axe, working in the methodical way Silas had taught. Don't fight the grain, follow it. She rigged the first pulley to the juniper roots, running the rope through the wheel and back to the sandstone outcrop, where it ran through the second pulley, and then down to the wagon's front axle, which she had cleaned of sand and tested for integrity. The mechanical advantage she had created was not enormous. She was not an engineer, and she had neither the tools nor the materials for complex rigging, but it was enough to change the terms of the problem. With the block and tackle working, each pound of force she applied would move the wagon with the force of several pounds. She planted the cottonwood lever against the near rear wheel and began. The first hour produced movement that could be measured in inches. She would work the lever, driving the wheel up and forward through the sand, then move to the rope and pull, then back to the lever, then adjust the anchor points and begin again. It was not graceful. It was not fast. It was the kind of work that does not look like anything from a distance, which perhaps explains why 3 of the men on the rim eventually lost interest and rode on. 8 remained. By midday, she had moved the wagon 4 feet. Her hands were raw under her work gloves. There was a burning in her upper back that would be much worse tomorrow. She ate a strip of salt pork and drank from the creek without sitting down. In the afternoon, the light in the canyon changed, the sun dropping behind the western wall and leaving the floor in cool shadow, while the upper rim still blazed orange. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes. She kept working. Dutch Haller's voice came from the rim in the late afternoon, carrying the particular authority of a man accustomed to being heard over distance. He had a freighter's voice trained by years of calling commands across loading yards and wagon bridges. That wagon's been there since November of '72, girl. What in the Lord's name do you think you're going to do with it? She did not look up. She reset the rope anchor wound 3 turns around the cottonwood capstan, set her feet, and pulled. The wagon moved 8 inches in one pull. That was the most it had moved in any single effort since she started. She heard Dutch say something else, but the words were lost in the scrape of iron on stone as the rear wheel found purchase on a subsurface shelf of rock she had not known was there. The wheel climbed the rock, the wagon tilted, shifted, and for one long moment the entire mass seemed to balance on a point of inevitability. And then it came forward with a momentum that surprised even her, and she had to scramble to reset the rope before it slid backward. That evening she made camp where she had been sleeping for 3 nights in the dugout, a quarter mile downstream, that she had found on her first day in the canyon. She had already reinforced its roof with poles cut from the cottonwood, had swept it out, had fashioned a crude door from 3 boards she'd pried from a collapsed fence line along the canyon wall. It was shelter. It was hers. She made coffee and ate beans from the pot, and did not think about the smithy or Silas Morrow's tools lined up in the rack the morning she had oiled them for the last time, or the way the Peter Wright anvil had caught the afternoon light through the west window, in a way she had been seeing her whole life and would apparently never see again. She thought about the wagon instead, about the angle of the bank, about the root structure of the juniper, about tomorrow. Silas Morrow had come to Crestfall from Pennsylvania in 1859, 14 years before the winter that killed him. He had brought his tools and his anvil and his knowledge in a wagon, not unlike the one at the bottom of the wash, and he had set up his smithy on a corner lot that he paid for with 3 months of work at a Salt Lake City foundry. He had built the shop himself. The walls adobe and stone, the roof heavy timber brought down from the mountains on a borrowed mule. He had buried his wife there in the small cemetery at the north edge of town 2 years after arriving, and had not spoken of her to anyone in the 12 years that followed. He had been a solitary man, which is perhaps why he had recognized the quality in the girl who appeared at his doorway when she was 12 years old. She had not asked to be there. She had simply arrived one morning and stood watching, and he had not sent her away, and that had been the beginning of the only real education Nora Vale had ever received. She had come to him from her cousin Aldous Cray's household, where she had lived since the age of 5, since the cholera had taken her parents on the trail west, somewhere in the Wyoming Territory, in the summer of 1860. She did not remember their faces clearly anymore. She remembered a quality of light, the particular shade of late afternoon sun through canvas, and the smell of fresh river water, and the sound of her mother singing something without words. Then the memory went blank, the way a fire goes blank when you pour sand over it all at once. No residue. Aldous Cray had not been a cruel man in the way that violent men are cruel. He had been cruel in the administrative way, the way of a man who considers generosity a transaction and keeps careful accounts. He had taken Nora in because it was the Christian thing to do, and he had extracted 10 years of labor from her in return because that was the Christian thing to do also. And he had never seen any contradiction between these two positions. She had learned silence in that house. She had learned to read the set of a jaw and the angle of a shoulder and the particular quality of stillness that precedes an eruption. She had learned to make herself useful before being asked to be finished, before being noticed to occupy space without appearing to occupy space. Then she had found the smithy and Silas Morrow and the hammer, and learned that her hands could make things rather than merely maintain them. For 7 years, the smithy had been the fixed point of her life. Not home exactly, she had slept at Aldous' until she was 16, and after that in a small room behind the post office that she rented for $2 a month. But the smithy was where she understood herself. It was where her skills lived, where her competence was real and visible and could be held in the hand and weighed. When Silas died in January of 1874, she had been 19 years old, and the best smith in Crestfall, though no one in Crestfall had quite gotten around to saying so out loud. Deacon Harlan Price had not waited long. He was a man of about 50, built in the rectangular way of men who were once physically powerful and have since traded that power for a different kind. He led the local congregation with the same authority he brought to his mercantile, and his land dealings a comprehensive, all-encompassing authority that presented itself as benevolence and was, in fact, something considerably colder. He had been in Crestfall since before Nora arrived, had been acquiring land and influence steadily for 15 years, and he moved through the town with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never seriously contemplated not getting what he wants. The morning of February 3rd, 1874, his clerk had appeared at the smithy door. The clerk was a pale young man named Ord, who held documents the way other people hold things they are not sure are safe at a slight distance with minimal contact. He had stood in the doorway without crossing the threshold, as though the smithy itself had a jurisdiction that he was not certain he was authorized to enter, and he had offered the papers to Nora without meeting her eyes. It was a ledger sheet, a tally of debts allegedly owed by the late Silas Morrow to the Crestfall tithing office and to Price's own mercantile. The figures covered 8 years of claimed loans for coal, for tool steel, for sundry supplies. Nora knew every transaction Silas had made with the mercantile because she had been present for most of them. And Silas had been a cash man, constitutionally incapable of buying anything he could not pay for on the day of purchase. He had once walked out of the mercantile without a bag of nails he needed, because he was 40 cents short and refused to put them on account. The total on the ledger sheet was $340. At the bottom, in Price's precise practiced script, in consideration of the forgiveness of this debt, the deed and title to the smithy property and the adjoining eastern lot will be transferred to the account of Deacon H. Price in full satisfaction. Vacate within 24 hours of receipt of this notice. She had read it twice. Then she had handed it back to Ord, who had looked briefly startled, as though he had expected her to keep it. She told him she did not need to keep it, because she understood it. She closed the door. She spent the rest of that day the way Silas had taught her to do difficult things methodically, without hurry, giving each task its proper attention. She cleaned the forge. She oiled the tools and hung them on their pegs. She swept the floor. When the man from the mercantile came to inventory Silas's tools, the rounding hammers, the flatters and fullers, the tongs Silas had shaped across 30 years, for 30 specific purposes, she watched him work his way through the rack and make his offer $20 for the lot. She took it without negotiating. $20 was $20. She packed her canvas sack. She took her clothes, her skillet, her flour, her coffee, her salt pork, her block of matches. She wrapped Silas's hammer in oilcloth and placed it at the bottom of the sack, where it would not shift. Then she walked out of the smithy, left the door unlocked, and did not look back. She had walked south out of Crestfall's grid of streets and into the open country that rolled and broke apart toward the canyon lands. The air had changed within a mile, wood smoke and livestock, giving way to the cold, sage-sharp breath of the high desert, a smell she had always associated with honesty, with the absence of human complication. The road had dissolved to a track, and the track to a suggestion, and by late afternoon she had found the canyon. Red Creek Canyon was not a gentle place. The walls rose 200 feet on either side, red and orange and occasional cream-colored, layered in bands that told of time measured in epochs rather than years. The creek at the bottom ran shallow and clear-edged with cottonwoods, whose bare winter branches made a delicate lacework against the sky. It was a place that made the business of Crestfall the ledger sheets and the mercantile, and the deacon's careful accumulations feel extremely small. She had found the dugout that first evening, found it by the smell of old ash from the stone hearth, found it workable if not comfortable, and had slept in it without difficulty. In the morning she had found the wagon, and the morning after that she had gone to the land office with 10 of her $20 and bought the salvage certificate from the man with the two-fingered grip. And then she had gone to the mercantile for the rope and the pulleys. And then she had come back to the canyon and begun. The second day of the salvage was harder than the first. The terrain between the wash and the flat ground near the dugout was not consistent. There were stretches of good firm sand where the wagon moved with relative ease, and there were sections of loose shale that shifted under the wheel loads and had to be bridged with flat stones she carried by hand one at a time from the creek bed. Building a surface solid enough to carry 1,200 pounds without collapsing back into chaos, she worked through the heat of the morning. By noon, the temperature in the canyon had climbed to the low 70s, warm for March in Utah, and the reflected heat from the sandstone walls added another 10 degrees to the effective temperature on the canyon floor. She soaked her bandana in the creek and tied it around her head and kept working. The men on the rim that morning were different men from the day before, but they had been briefed on the situation. She could tell from the way they arranged themselves, the way the laughter started before they had had time to properly assess what they were seeing. Someone in Crestfall had been talking. She counted 7 of them at one point in the late morning. She recognized Dutch Haller by his horse, a big gray roan that he kept in conspicuously good condition. And she recognized the voice of a man named Prescott, who ran the feed store, and who had once told Silas Morrow that teaching a girl to smith was like teaching a cat to swim. Technically possible, but hard on everyone involved. She did not respond to any of it. Response required attention, and attention was a resource she was spending entirely on the wagon. By mid-afternoon, the front wheels were at the base of the final slope, the hardest section of the route, a 15-foot grade that rose steeply to the flat ground above. She had prepared this section the most carefully, had spent 2 hours the previous evening cutting and placing flat stones across the full width of the wagon's track, had driven juniper stakes into the hillside to create anchor points for a doubled rope that would prevent the wagon from sliding backward between pulls. She planted the cottonwood lever under the front axle. She took up the slack in the rope. She set her feet in the way Silas had shown her, weight low and backdrive from the legs, not the arms. She pulled. The wagon moved, then stopped, then moved again, 3 inches, then 6. The rear wheels found the first of the stone steps she had laid and climbed it with a lurch. She reset, pulled again. The front axle was 2 feet up the slope, then 4 feet. Her hands were beyond pain now, into the quieter territory of pure sensation. The nerves too fatigued to distinguish between hot and cold, between the rope and her own skin. The voices from the rim had gone quiet. She was aware of this the way she was aware of everything peripherally without looking. 6 feet up the slope, 8 feet. At 10 feet, with the front wheels cresting the top of the grade, the rear of the wagon hit a buried rock shelf she had not known was there and stopped cold. She heard the rope creak with the sudden arrested load. She held the tension for 3 seconds, feeling the energy in the system the way you feel it in a piece of iron that is right at the edge of its temper. She moved the lever to the rear axle, planted it, and pushed. The rear wheel rose over the rock shelf. The wagon tilted forward. The front wheels completed their arc and settled onto the flat ground. And then, with a sound like a long exhalation, a groan of wood and iron and 15 months of inertia, released all at once, the rear wheels followed, and the wagon came to rest on level ground, rocking slightly on its 3 intact wheels before finding equilibrium. The silence from the canyon rim was complete. She stood with her hands on her hips, breathing covered in dust and sweat and the red clay of the canyon floor, and looked at what she had moved. 1,200 pounds, 11 people's certainty that it couldn't be done. 2 days of work that no one had thought worth doing. She looked up at the rim for the first time. Dutch Holler was the last man still there. He sat his gray roan at the rim's edge, looking down at her, and for a moment they held each other's gaze across 200 feet of open air. She could not read his expression at that distance, but she read the stillness of it, the quality of a man who has revised a calculation and is not yet sure what the new answer means. He turned his horse and rode back toward Crestfall without a word. She turned back to the wagon. She had work to do. The work of disassembly began the next morning, and it had the quality of a careful conversation, the kind where you learn more the longer you listen. She started with what she needed most immediately. The dugout, for all its accidental shelter, had no proper floor, no door worth the name, and a roof that let in a cold wind through the gaps between the juniper pole lattice and the sod covering. She needed oak boards, and the wagon had plenty. She worked the first board loose with the small pry bar from Silas's toolkit, the one tool she had kept back from the mercantile inventory by the simple method of having it in her pocket when Ord did his count. The board came free with a sound of pulled nails, clean and solid 3-inch thick white oak, the kind of material that costs $1 a board foot in Crestfall. She worked 3 boards free and set them aside. She was starting on the 4th when she noticed it. The sound. She had been tapping each board with the head of Silas's hammer before prying it. Not for any particular reason, just the habit of listening that Silas had built into her. Always tap first, hear what the thing says before you start changing it. Most boards gave back the same dull thud, the sound of solid wood against the solid frame below. But the board near the left front corner of the wagon bed gave back something different. She tapped it again. Hollow. Not hollow the way a rotted board is hollow. This was a precise engineered hollow. The resonance of an airspace bounded by tight joinery. She set the hammer down and ran her fingers along the seams. She had been in enough workshops, had handled enough finished woodwork alongside Silas's rough iron world to know the difference between a wagon builder's joinery and a cabinet maker's joinery. The seams here were cabinet maker's work, tight and clean and consistent, the kind of fit that holds without glue, because the tolerances are so close that air itself can barely pass between them. She found the catch on the 3rd pass. It was a small indentation in the edge of the board, precisely placed, designed to be invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking. She pressed it with the tip of her index finger. A section of the floor, roughly 4 feet square, bounded by 4 boards, lifted with a soft mechanical click, hinged along its far edge by a length of flat iron mortised flush into the wood on both sides. Beneath it was darkness and the smell of oilcloth and dry wool. She held still for a moment, listening to the canyon, wind in the cottonwoods, the thin sound of the creek. Nothing else. She reached into the compartment, The first bundle was wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a leather thong that had been knotted by someone who expected the knot to hold for a long time. She untied it carefully and unrolled the oilcloth on the flat ground beside the wagon, nested in a bed of raw wool-blued steel catching the morning light. Was a rifle unlike any she had seen. She picked it up with both hands the way Silas had taught her to pick up any piece of unknown metalwork respectfully, as though it might be fragile, though nothing about this object suggested fragility. The stock was walnut dark and swirling finish to a depth that spoke of weeks of patient work. The barrel was octagonal, the flats machined to a precision that she could feel with her thumb. The blued finish deep and even, and interrupted only by the engraving on the lock plate scrollwork of extraordinary delicacy. The kind of work that required a jeweler's patience in a blacksmith's medium. She had learned enough from Silas to recognize masterwork when she held it. This was masterwork. She unwrapped the remaining 4 bundles. Each held a rifle of similar quality each, a distinct piece, the same level of craft applied with slight variations in stock shape and engraving pattern, in the specific configuration of hardware. 5 custom rifles, 5 unique objects, each one worth more than she had ever held in her hands at one time. She turned to the express box. It was small and dense, banded in iron that had been painted black, marked with the stenciled letters of Wells Fargo and Company in white paint that had faded to cream. The lock was a 3-tumbler mechanism, good quality. The kind of lock that yielded to a proper key in under a second, and to a careful hand with a piece of iron wire in under 3 minutes. She took a file from her kit, bent a short length of wire from a piece she had saved from the wagon hardware, and began. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The lid opened. Gold coins. Double eagles minted in San Francisco, dated 1871 and 1872, packed in cloth-lined trays. With the careful density of a man who knows exactly how many coins fit in a given volume, and has achieved that number. She did not count them. She did not need to. She could see it was a great deal of money. More money than Aldous Cray had made in any 5 years of his careful accumulating life. More money than Crest Falls Mercantile turned in profit in a season. She closed the lid. The leather satchel was last. It was old, the leather dried and cracked at the fold lines, the stitching still intact. Inside was a folded document, a shipping manifest on the official stationery of Wells Fargo and Company, and a smaller, narrower booklet that turned out to be a driver's log, the kind of record book that freight companies require their men to maintain on long routes. She sat down on the flat ground with her back against the wagon wheel and began to read. The manifest was formal and specific in the way that government documents are specific, each item listed with weight and value and chain of custody. 5 custom sporting rifles commissioned by order of the United States Department of the Interior. Value $400 per unit. 1 Wells Fargo Express box containing $5,000 in gold coin, being payment in full for said rifles upon delivery to the commanding officer at Fort Cameron, Utah Territory. Shipper Elias Voss, Master Gunsmith, Salt Lake City, Utah Territory. Consignee Deacon Harlan Price, Crestfall, Utah Territory, acting under letter of authorization from the Department of the Interior. She read Price's name twice. Then she opened the driver's log. The handwriting was a working man's handwriting, functional. slightly compressed, the product of someone who had learned penmanship for practical purposes rather than aesthetic ones. The entries began in October of 1872 and covered a freight run from Salt Lake City south through the territory with stops and weather notes and mileage recorded in the straightforward language of a man doing a job. The driver's name was printed on the inside front cover, in the same hand Walter J. Greer, licensed freight operator. She turned to the last entry. November 14th, 1872. The ink was slightly different from the preceding entries, the same pen, but the pressure varied as though the hand holding it was not entirely steady. She read the entry 3 times. Entering Red Creek Canyon on the southern approach. Cargo intact. Deacon Price of Crestfall sent word to meet him at the canyon's south end to take personal delivery of the government payment box, rather than completing delivery at Fort Cameron. Unusual, but the deacon holds the letter of authorization, so I have no grounds to refuse. Canyon walls very close here. Will update at South Terminus. There was no update at the South Terminus. There were no more entries. The remaining pages of the log were blank. She sat very still. Walt Greer had driven into Red Creek Canyon on November 14th, 1872, 15 months ago, and had not driven out. Deacon Price had organized the search party in the weeks following. She remembered the talk from that time had been present in the periphery of it, the way she was always present in the periphery of Crestfall's business. Price standing in front of the congregation, his voice heavy with regret, speaking about the lawlessness of the territory, about the dangers of the roads, about the brave and unfortunate Walt Greer, who had been murdered by road agents who had left no trace and apparently taken everything. He had stood in his church and said those words while the wagons sat in the wash at the bottom of the canyon and the rifles sat in their compartment, and Walt Greer's last log entry waited in its leather satchel. Price had not been the victim of a robbery. He had been its architect. He had killed Walt Greer, or had had him killed, and pushed the wagon into the wash, closed the false floor over the evidence, and walked back to Crestfall to deliver a eulogy. He had not imagined that anyone would haul the wagon out. Nora sat with the manifest and the logbook in her hands and felt the weight of what she was holding. Not the physical weight, though. The express box was heavy, but the other weight, the weight of knowledge that changes the terms of everything around it. She was 19 years old, alone in a canyon, and she was holding a murder case. She also had no roof on her dugout, no door that would stop a determined man, and nothing between her and the open trail except 200 feet of canyon wall. She moved with careful efficiency. The rifles went back into their oilcloth and back into the false compartment. She lowered the hinged floor panel and examined it from every angle until she was satisfied it looked undisturbed. The express box she carried to the dugout and placed in the deepest corner, covering it completely with a stack of firewood she had gathered 2 days ago. The manifest and the log she wrapped in their own oilcloth and tucked beneath her bedroll. Then she went back to work on the dugout because the work needed to be done and because anyone watching from the rim would see exactly what they expected to see: a girl repairing a hole in the ground. In the days that followed, the canyon became the site of something that Nora had no name for at the time, though she recognized its texture. It was not friendship exactly. It was the more durable thing that sometimes precedes friendship. The thing built from observed competence and practical exchange. Dutch Holler appeared one afternoon on the rim, and lowered a barrel of clean water down the cliff face on a length of rope without speaking. She had not asked for it, and she did not go up to thank him, because that would have required acknowledging the gesture in a way that would have been uncomfortable for both of them. She used the water. 3 days later, she found a section of iron wheel rim that she did not need and forged it using her field fire and the flat stone she had been using as a makeshift anvil into a set of draft hooks of the kind a freighter uses. She left them at the base of the canyon trail with no note. Dutch Holler picked them up on his next pass. Ruth Canby came down the canyon trail on a Thursday carrying a covered pot and moving with the careful precision of someone who has learned that uneven ground is not to be trusted, but refuses to let it change her route. She was a woman of about 60, with a sharp, assessing face and the calloused hands of someone who had worked for everything she had. She looked at the dugout, the new door, the stone chimney repointed with fresh clay, the neat stack of firewood, and she looked at the work in progress on the wagon, and she set the pot down on the flat rock by the fire ring without ceremony. Rabbit stew. A body needs a decent meal when she's working this hard, Ruth said. That was all she said on the subject. She stayed long enough to drink a cup of coffee, ask 2 practical questions about the door joinery, and walk back up the trail. The next Saturday she came again, and the Saturday after that. People from the outskirts of Crestfall began to find their way to the canyon with broken things. A farmer named Goss left a plowshare at the base of the trail with 3 eggs and a note that said, "Busted." She fixed it on her field forge using the wagon's iron for stock material and left it at the base of the trail with the eggs untouched. Goss came back the following week with a broken cultivator tine and a side of bacon, and the week after that with a neighbor who had a broken harness buckle and a dozen ears of dried corn. The work was always clean and the metal was always sound, and the payment was always enough. She was becoming a part of the place. Not of Crestfall, she had no illusions about Crestfall, but of this piece of country, this Red Rock Canyon, and the rough edge of land around it, where people lived at the margin of the town's influence and got along without it more often than not. The knowledge of the express box and the rifles and Walt Greer's last log entry sat in her chest like a coal banked for the night present and hot beneath a quiet surface. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned a piece of iron in the fire, examining every side, considering every implication. She could not keep it secret indefinitely. Price was not a stupid man, and the wagon's emergence from the canyon had been public enough that he would eventually grow curious about what she had found in it. She needed an ally, someone with authority that Price could not reach, someone who would understand what the manifest and the log represented and would know how to move on it. She was still working out the details of her approach when the stranger appeared. He came on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of March, riding a nondescript brown horse and wearing the clothes of a traveling merchant. Dark coat, flat-brimmed hat, saddlebags that clinked. He introduced himself as a buyer of salvage goods, said he had heard about the wagon, asked in the pleasant, unhurried way of a man with time to spare whether she had found anything inside worth selling. She said no, and the word had a finality in it that ended the conversation before it had properly begun. He rode away without pressing the point. That evening, Dutch Haller came down the canyon trail at a pace that was not his usual pace. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and stood in front of her with the expression of a man who has made a decision about something and is now living with the consequences of that decision. He told her straight. Price had been asking questions about the wagon in Crestfall for the past week, asking what she might have found in it, whether anyone had seen her carrying anything out. The stranger who had visited that morning was a man named Ord Price's clerk, riding a borrowed horse in borrowed clothes. And 2 days ago, a man Dutch did not recognize had been on the canyon rim at dusk, not riding, just standing looking down at the dugout in the last of the light. Dutch said, "I don't know what you found in that wagon, and I'm not asking. But Price doesn't send his clerk on social calls. Whatever it is you've got, maybe 3 days before he stops asking and starts doing." He said it without drama, the way you tell someone the weather is turning because it is useful information and they need to have it. She thanked him. He rode back up the trail. She sat by the fire and thought about timing. She thought about Marshal Ferris Lund, who covered this district on a monthly circuit that brought him through Crestfall on the 4th Tuesday of every month, which was 11 days away. Too far. She would need to intercept him on the road, which meant knowing which road. She knew which road. She also knew that Dutch was right about the timeline. Price had been patient for 15 months. He had let the wagon sit in the canyon because letting it sit was easier and safer than going down to retrieve it himself. And because no one in Crestfall had ever given him reason to think that a girl with $20 and a piece of salvage paper could change that calculation. But the calculation had changed, and she had changed it, and he knew it. 3 days, Dutch had said. On the evening of March 21st, 1874, just as the light was draining from the canyon walls, Deacon Harlan Price came down the trail. She heard the horse before she saw him, a single horse moving carefully in the loose rock of the upper trail. The sound of a man who knows the path well enough to navigate it in fading light. She was at the fire ring when he emerged from the shadows of the lower canyon, and she had been at the fire ring for the past hour, working at nothing in particular, waiting because she had been expecting this. He dismounted and tied his horse to the wagon wheel with a practice loop and walked to the fire as though he had been invited, which he had not. He was a large, well-made man, and he moved with the ease of someone for whom physical presence has always been a reliable instrument. In the firelight, his face was all shadow and angle, the face of a man who has spent decades arranging his features into expressions of concern and authority. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He reached into his coat and produced a folded leather wallet, opened it and withdrew a sheaf of bills that he set on the flat rock between them. With the calm deliberateness of someone laying down a hand of cards he believes is unbeatable. $200, he said, for the salvage contents of the wagon. All of it. No questions, no accounting. She looked at the money. She looked at him. Price's face was composed, but she had been reading men's faces since she was 5 years old, and she read this one clearly. Behind the composure was something coiled and watchful, the attention of a man who needs a specific answer and has not yet received it, and is not accustomed to that experience. She reached out, picked up the money, counted it slowly, and handed it back. "I didn't find anything worth $200, she said. His eyes held hers for a long moment. She did not look away. He folded the bills back into his wallet, replaced the wallet in his coat, and untied his horse from the wagon wheel with the same measured deliberateness with which he had arrived. He mounted without hurry. He looked down at her from the saddle for just a moment long enough to communicate something, though the expression was too controlled for her to read precisely. And then he turned his horse and rode back up the trail into the dark. The fire crackled. The cottonwoods made their sound. The creek made its sound. She stayed by the fire for another hour, not sleeping, not moving much, letting the stillness of the canyon fill in around the shape of what had just happened. Then she went to the dugout, retrieved the manifest and the logbook from beneath her bedroll, and wrapped them again in their oilcloth against the damp of the night. She needed to move before he did. Tomorrow she would find Marshal Ferris Lund. She was on the trail before first light. The canyon was dark at that hour, the stars still bright in the strip of sky between the walls, the creek making its thin, steady sound somewhere to her left. She had left the express box buried under the firewood. She had left the rifles in the false floor of the wagon, which sat on the flat ground above the dugout in the early spring cold, its missing boards giving it the look of something in the process of being either built or demolished. She carried the manifest and the log, and one of the 5 rifles wrapped in its oilcloth slung across her back. She had thought carefully about which one to take, not the most ornate that might appear to be stolen goods, a prize rather than evidence. She had chosen the simplest of the 5, the one whose distinguishing marks were most clearly the marks of craft rather than decoration. The octagonal barrel, the specific profile of the action, the particular way the lock plate was let into the stock. These were the marks of a specific maker, and a man who knew firearms would know the maker immediately. Ferris Lund's circuit took him north out of Moab on the 3rd Monday of each month, and he passed through the canyon country on a route that skirted the western edge of the Red Creek drainage before joining the main road that led north to Crestfall and beyond. She had pieced this together from conversations with Dutch Haller, and from a chance remark Ruth Canby had made about the marshal's habits. She did not know exactly where on the road she would find him, but she knew the road and she knew approximately when, and she started walking. She found him 2 hours after sunrise. He was a tall man, angular in the way of men who have spent years in the saddle, in harsh country, with a long-service marshal's face, watchful and economical, the face of someone who has learned to withhold judgment as a professional practice rather than a personal virtue. He had a deputy with him, a younger man, who stayed back when Lund reined in at the sight of a young woman standing in the middle of the road with a rifle across her back and no horse in sight. He did not reach for anything. He just looked at her with the patient attention of someone waiting for the situation to explain itself. "Marshal," she said, "my name is Nora Vale. I have something you need to see." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he dismounted. She led him off the road to a flat-topped rock that served as a natural table, unwrapped the rifle, and laid it across the surface. She stepped back and let him look. He picked it up with both hands, turned it over, raised it to examine the barrel from the breech. He looked at the lock plate for a long time, his thumb moving over the engraved scrollwork. "This is Elias Voss's work," he said, "out of Salt Lake. There's no other smith in the territory cuts flats like this." "There are 4 more," she said. She placed the manifest and the logbook on the rock beside the rifle. He read them standing up, the manifest first, then the log, going back twice to the manifest to cross-check specific items. She watched his face and saw the moment when the last piece settled into place. A small shift, almost nothing, the kind of internal adjustment that only shows in a person's eyes when they are too absorbed in thought to maintain their surface expression. He looked up from the log. "Walt Greer," he said. "I know that name. The missing driver." Price led the search. She said nothing. She did not need to. Lund looked at the log again, at the last entry, at Walt Greer's slightly unsteady hand, writing about the south end of the canyon, about Deacon Price's instructions, about the goods he was about to deliver to a man who was gonna kill him. "You've put yourself in considerable danger, Miss Vale." "I know," she said. "That's why I came to you before sunrise." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the rifle, looking at the papers, looking at her. "Where is the express box hidden?" she said. "Under my firewood. It hasn't been opened since I found it." This surprised him, she could tell. He had perhaps expected something to be missing. He nodded slowly. "I'll need all of it," he said. "The box, the rifles, the manifest, the log. Everything. It's safer with you than with me," she said. She had been waiting 3 days to say. Those words had rehearsed them until they came out the way she intended. Not as a plea, but as a statement of practical fact. She was not asking for protection. She was completing a transaction. They rode back to her camp together, Lund and his deputy, and she walked ahead. When she lifted the firewood from the express box and Lund opened it and saw the gold, his expression did not change. He was a man who had learned not to show surprise as a matter of professional practice, but he stayed very still for a moment, in the way of a man who is recalibrating, adjusting the scale of what he is dealing with. He wrapped each rifle in its oilcloth. He placed the express box in his saddlebag. He took the manifest and the log. He looked at Nora's camp, the solid door, the clean fire ring, the field forge she had built from river stones, the stacks of reclaimed lumber from the wagon arranged by size against the canyon wall. And he looked at Nora, and he seemed to be thinking something that he did not say. He said, "I'll send word when it's done." He and his deputy rode north. Nora stood by her fire and watched them go. Then she went back to work. The night of March 21st, after Price's visit, she had been afraid. Not the theatrical kind of fear that announces itself and asks to be soothed, but the useful kind, the kind that makes you inventory your situation clearly and honestly, and plan accordingly. She had used it well, she thought. She had moved the right pieces before the board shifted. Now there was nothing to do but wait and work. And work had always been the better of those two things. On the morning of March 23rd, 1874, Deacon Harlan Price ate breakfast at the large table in his stone house on the corner of Crest Falls Main Street, 3 houses east of the Congregation Hall, 2 houses west of his mercantile. He ate alone as he usually did. He had been married twice, and both wives had predeceased him, and he had not remarried, and the house was very large for one man. He was on his 2nd cup of coffee when he heard horses in the street. He recognized the sound, more than one horse moving with purpose, not passing through, but stopping. He set his cup down. He stood. He straightened his coat in the habitual way of a man who has spent decades presenting himself to the world as someone of consequence. Marshal Ferris Lund came through the front door without knocking, which was a statement. His deputy came behind him. Dutch Haller came last, which surprised Price. Dutch had always been manageable. Lund walked to the table. He set the shipping manifest on the polished wood surface, smoothing it flat with the back of his hand, then stepped back. Price looked at the document. He saw his own name in the consignee line. He saw the signature he had applied to the letter of authorization from the Department of the Interior, a letter he had obtained through a contact in Salt Lake who was no longer in a position to be contacted. He saw Walt Greer's name in the shipper's signature block, Walt Greer, who had come to this table in a manner of speaking after 15 months in the ground at the bottom of a canyon wash. The color left his face in the steady, thorough way that color leaves a thing when the heat is gone. He said nothing for a long time. Deacon Harlan Price Lund said, and his voice had the flat quality of a man reading from a document he has memorized. You are under arrest for theft of federal property mail fraud and suspicion of murder in the first degree of one Walter James Greer, licensed freight operator, in Red Creek Canyon, Utah Territory, on or about the 14th of November, 1872. Price looked at the manifest once more. He looked at his own signature. The careful, practiced signature he had applied to hundreds of documents over 20 years of careful, practiced accumulation. The signature that was supposed to be at the bottom of a canyon, forever covered in river sand, inaccessible to everything except time. He did not resist. There was nothing to resist against. The paper on the table was more absolute than any physical force. He was led out through his own front door into the Crestfall Street, where people were already gathering in the particular way of people who have been waiting for a thing to happen and are surprised only by the specific form it has taken. The news moved through the town in the way that significant news always moves, not as rumor, which is uneven and distorted, but as fact, which moves faster and with more weight. By noon, the street in front of Price's Mercantile was full of people talking in the careful, relieved voices of those who have been holding something back for a long time. By evening, the talk had expanded to include things that had not been connected before the land dealings. The ledger sheets, the mysterious losses of men who had disagreed with the deacon at inopportune times. The clerk Ord gave a voluntary statement to Lund's deputy that afternoon, standing in the street in front of the land office with his hat in his hands, his voice steady, and his eyes finally meeting someone else's eyes, for what appeared to be the first time in years. The territorial court convened in Moab in late April. Nora rode to Moab on a horse Dutch Haller had lent her without being asked. She had never testified in a court before, had never spoken to more than 3 people at once, with any expectation that they were genuinely listening. She sat in the witness chair in a room that smelled of pine resin and tobacco, and too many people, and she answered every question the court put to her in the same voice she used when she was explaining a repair to a farmer. Direct, specific, without elaboration beyond what was asked. She described finding the wagon. She described the salvage. She described the sound the hammer made on the false floor. She described what was inside. She read the last entry from Walt Greer's log from memory, because she had memorized it over the weeks of waiting, the words pressing themselves into her mind from sheer repetition. Entering Red Creek Canyon on the southern approach, cargo intact. Deacon Price of Crestfall sent word to meet him at the canyon's south end. She described Price's visit to her camp on the evening of March 21st. She described the $200 he had offered. She described his eyes, The court found Harlan Price guilty on all counts. The judgment on salvage rights came separately issued by the Territorial Land Court 3 weeks after the criminal verdict. The language was formal and specific. The contents of the abandoned vehicle having been unclaimed and abandoned for a period exceeding 12 months, and having been recovered at personal expense and risk by the finder, were hereby declared the lawful property of one Nora Vale resident, Red Creek Canyon, Utah Territory. The firearms in the express box, having served their purpose as evidence, were released from court custody and conveyed to her by Marshal Lund on a Tuesday afternoon in May, delivered in a canvas-covered wagon to the base of the canyon trail. She stood next to the wagon and looked at the express box and tried to locate a feeling equal to the occasion. What she found instead was the same clarity she had found on her first night in the canyon. A cool, bracing simplicity. The simplicity of a situation that has resolved into its correct shape. $5,000, 5 rifles, and a salvage certificate with her name on it, signed by the clerk of the Territorial Court. The same court whose clerk had in an earlier life processed the paperwork for Deacon Price. She used the money as she had planned in the order she had planned it. First, she paid her February rent to herself, the $10 she had spent on pulleys and rope, the $10 she had spent on food. She set the coins out on the flat rock by the fire ring and looked at them for a moment and then put them away. Second, she rode to Crestfall and walked into the land office for the second time in her life. The man with the 2-fingered grip was behind his counter. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has drastically miscalculated, which is to say, he looked at her very carefully and without any of his earlier comfortable superiority. She placed $400 on the counter. The deed to the smithy on the corner lot, she said. The property of the late Silas Morrow, currently held in default by the estate of Harlan Price. The man produced the deed. It took him longer than it should have, because his hands were not cooperating with him, but he produced it. The transfer document was drawn up by the court clerk, who had processed the salvage judgment. The same court clerk who had in another life processed the paperwork that handed Price his fraudulent claim to the same property. She did not point this out. It was visible enough without pointing. She walked out of the land office with the deed in her hand, the paper dry and specific in her fingers. And she walked down the street to the corner lot and stood in front of the building she had cleaned and oiled and swept and loved and walked away from without looking back. 4 months ago. The door was unlocked. Price had not bothered to secure it, which told her something about how little he had valued what was inside. She pushed it open. The smell hit her before the light cold iron and old ash, and the particular dry smell of banked coal. A smell that had no equivalent in the world of comfortable houses. A smell that was entirely and solely itself. She stood in the doorway and breathed it. The tools were still on the rack. Ord must have inventoried them, but never sold them, perhaps assuming Price had a use for them. Perhaps understanding on some level that they were not the kind of objects that should be dispersed. The rounding hammers, the flatters and fullers, the tongs Silas had shaped for 30 years of 30 specific purposes. The Peter Wright anvil in the center of the room, its scarred face catching the light from the west window the way it always had. She walked to the workbench. She set down the oilcloth bundle she had been carrying and unwrapped it one of the 5 Voss rifles, the simplest of them, the one she had carried to the meeting with Marshal Lund. She placed it on the bench. Then she reached into her work belt and took out Silas's hammer. 14 ounces of perfectly balanced iron hickory handle, worn smooth by a decade of her grip and the decade of his before that, and placed it on the bench beside the rifle. She looked at them, 2 objects made by 2 men who knew their craft completely. 2 men who had been betrayed by the same person in different ways, in different years for the same reason. Because what they made was valuable and what they were was not to a man like Price worth accounting for. Walt Greer had driven a wagon into a canyon on the word of a man he had no reason not to trust. Silas Morrow had built a life's work on a corner lot that someone else had decided he wanted. Both of them had ended up reduced to evidence, to items on a manifest, to lines in someone else's ledger. But they had also, without intending it, built the instruments of their own accounting. Greer's logbook, Voss's rifle, Morrow's hammer. The things that careful men make tend to outlast the men who unmake them. She picked up the hammer. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its balance, its particular rightness in her hand, the rightness of something made specifically for her by someone who had taken the time to understand what she needed. She set it back down on the bench. She turned to the forge. The coal was cold, but there was plenty of it. Price had not bothered to sell the coal either. She opened the air vent at the base of the firebox. She took a handful of kindling from the box beside the forge and laid it over the fire iron in the way Silas had taught her loosely, so the air could move through a tent rather than a pile. She struck a match. The kindling caught. She added coal, banking it around the young flame the way you bank anything you want to grow carefully, with room for it to breathe, not smothering it with too much at once. She worked the bellows 4 times slowly, watching the coal begin to glow at its edges. The fire took. The sound of the bellows filled the smithy, and the smell of heating coal joined the older smells that had lived in the walls for 14 years, and the light from the forge fire began to move across the ceiling in the dancing way of forge light, alive and restless and warm. Nora Vale stood in the doorway of Silas Morrow's smithy, her smithy now hers by salvage and by law, and by $400 of gold that a dead man's last act had placed in her path, and watched the fire come up. She was 19 years old. She had been homeless 4 months ago. She had had $20 and a hammer and a piece of salvage paper. And she had built from those 3 things a life that was beginning to have the solid, true feel of iron that has been worked correctly, shaped under heat and pressure, into something that will hold its form, that will not fracture under load, that will do what it was made to do. Outside, Crestfall was going about its business in the new, quieter way of a place that has had a weight removed from it. Dutch Haller's wagon would come past on its next circuit. Ruth Canby would come on Saturday with bread. Goss would come with a broken thing that needed fixing, and a side of something in payment. She turned back to the forge. There was work to do.